point of view, the President looks great right now. We're glad he's on our side, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
You're the only one left.
Well, the only person left up here who hasn't spoken is Arthur Finkelstein. He is one of the Republican Party's premier pollsters, heads his own firm, of which he's founder and president, Arthur J. Finkelstein Associates. He's worked in many Senate, gubernatorial, and congressional races, and I would say his big client for 1992 is Senator Al D'Amato of New York, who is going to be in a tough re-election fight, I assume. Arthur?
Fred assumes right. I always start these talks with a story that goes back to 1970 in Jim Buckley's race in New York. And there's a question I ask on surveys all the time. It's from the following list of names. Could you tell us whether you have a favorable or unfavorable opinion of each? If you have no opinion or never heard of the person, just say so. And the first name that year was Richard Nixon, and this particular respondent said he never heard of him. The next name was Spiro Agnew. He said he never heard of him. Nelson Rockefeller, and the governor, never heard of him. The three candidates that year for Senate, Buckley, Ottinger, and Goodell, never heard of any of them. The next question was, what's the single most important issue facing the United States today? And he said apathy. He was right. It was the most important issue then, and it is still the most important issue now. In a survey in Iowa some years ago, we asked the #1 cause of inflation, and among the top responses was high prices. In another state, we asked about the #1 cause of unemployment, and we got lack of jobs. And in my own beloved New York City, in case you couldn't tell, we asked the #1 cause of crime, and the answer was criminals. Now, it is in this context that political campaigns and issues and ideas are in fact argued. And that's very important for us as political people to understand. The factors mentioned by everyone up here so far, I'm going to reiterate in a sort of more theoretical sense. But it is absolutely the case that where we failed in 1990 was to make those hard divisions in communication about how we were different from the other side. Mrs. Smith, do you use Crest toothpaste because of its advertising? Oh no, I use Crest toothpaste because it causes 23% fewer cavities. See, Mrs. Smith doesn't know what she knows, and she doesn't know where she got the information about what she knows. But she knows what she knows. You talk to anybody right now about Iraq, about Patriot missile systems, the world is now aware of what an Iraq is, where it is, what a Patriot missile is, et cetera, et cetera. The truth of the matter is we've done a very bad job in the last couple of years of communicating our interests and our intensity to the American public. Let me take you back in time a little bit, because 1990 is not the point. It goes back much before that. The Republican Party was a minority party back as far ago as 1964. A very real minority party, and conservatives were split between Democrats and Republicans fairly well. There were always more conservatives in this country, self-defined, than liberals. There were then, there were in 1980, there was in 1990. Nothing in that regard has changed. In fact, the numbers are almost precisely where they were 25 years ago or 10 years ago. What happened, though, was with the seminal election actually the seminal primary between Goldwater and Rockefeller, is that the Republican Party became the instrument of conservative ideology. Liberal Republicans left, conservative Democrats joined, and the Republican Party, in short, became the articulator of conservative ideas. But the two other factors that make up the way people vote, personality and behavior, did not change. Today, more people still call themselves Democrats than call themselves Republicans, while they call themselves conservative rather than liberal. There are three basic cluster groups around which people vote. They vote for people because they know them and they like them. They're attracted by them, either personalities or simply by appearance. We have lots of examples of that. We have the cluster group of identification, of structural intent. Republicans will vote for a Republican at a very high percentage. Democrats will vote Democrat at a very high percentage. Italians, hopefully in New York, will vote for Italians at a very high percentage. Structural identification is very important. If a Jewish fellow were to run against a Mormon in Salt Lake City for mayor, my guess is he would lose. If those two guys were to run in New York City, my guess is he would win. And the difference would not be on the campaign, but the structural aspects of the candidacies. The third part is the ideological differences that come to bear in a political campaign, the issues. Now, if we fight our races as Republican versus Democrat, we will lose statewide elections in virtually every state in the country. There are exceptions. There is a Kansas. Yes, Dorothy, there is a Kansas. But there is only a Kansas, and there is a New Hampshire. We're involved with Bob Smith's race last year in New Hampshire, and the victory was predicated on his ability to hold Republican votes. But if you hold Republican votes in New York, you're going to end up with 40% of the vote or 44% of the vote, but you're clearly going to go down to defeat. So your job is not to run Republican versus Democrat. The job is to attract Democrats. Now, unfortunately, most activists who get involved in politics as Republican activists in Republican areas, and we learn how to attract other Republicans. Well, we have not learned to do very well as a party, as a movement, if you will, is to attract people who do not start with their behavior leaning towards us. As far as personality is concerned, you know, the candidate you get, at least by the time I come into the picture, the candidate you get is the candidate you get. And your opponent is whoever your opponent is. Sometimes they're interesting, sometimes they're not. Whether or not they're decent men and women or not, we assume that they are. But interesting, photogenic, clever, articulate, etc., are qualities that are inherent. You can show better sides of the prism, but basically you're dealing with whatever fundamental interior core there is in the candidate. But we get around to issues. Since there are more people who call themselves conservatives than call themselves liberals, our job in race after race after race is to make it conservative versus liberal. It's just that simple. I've been criticized for 20 years for running ideologically arched campaigns. I plead guilty. I will continue to run ideologically arched campaigns as long as there are more conservatives than there are liberals, rather than more Democrats than there are Republicans. The kinds of issues, by the way, and there are 3 cluster groups, and this is also very important. There are economic clusters, foreign policy clusters, social issue clusters. The social issue clusters in 1990 were avoided by and large by Republican candidacies, those things that got us here. Ronald Reagan in 1980 narrowed the philosophical base of the Republican Party. And by narrowing it philosophically, we expanded the number of people who call themselves Republicans and who voted Republicans. Because by narrowing the philosophical base, we were able to reach over and take conservative Democrats and have them vote Republican in monstrous landslide proportions, which is when we captured the Senate and we won seats in places like Florida, New York, Oklahoma, elsewhere, North Carolina, that we were not expected to win, and we won them because of the narrowness of the political message, not because of its breadth. The 3 cluster groups were, in economics, yes, no new taxes, cut spending, balanced budget, etc., etc., etc. Except George Bush in 1990 kicked that away. He raised taxes. Suddenly the Republican candidate who went out and says, I promise you I will never cut taxes, now had the same lips that the president had. On foreign policy, communism collapsed. At least we were told communism collapsed. Gorby's making a comeback these days. But we were told it collapsed. And the fear of communism, defense spending, was opposed by virtually all Americans, conservatives as well as liberals. In poll after poll would tell you that we were spending too much on national defense. You would get a very different number today, but today is not 2 years ago. So we did not have the foreign policy component. I agree absolutely with what Fred said about Michael Dukakis and the tank being a seminal commercial, much far more important than Willie Horton ever was, because it spoke to the most important aspect of a presidential campaign, which is in fact foreign policy. The third cluster group is the social issue. And those break into two different groups. One, religious social groups, issues such as abortion, prayer in school, etc., that are religious in its nature and attractive to a certain slice of Americana. The other social issue group is the non-religious social group, which includes things like welfare, busing, crime, drugs, that are also important social issue concerns. We did not have a coherent theme about economy. Well, we did, but it was the wrong one. About foreign policy. For that matter, the social issues, we were running as far away from the religious social issues as we could get. And on non-religious social issues, the war on drugs became nothing more than just minor rhetoric. If we are going to win, we have to go back to those things that got us here. A strong fiscal program that in fact talks to the American public on their terms for their interests. Right now, we got locked in being seen as elitist and for taxes in the last election. We can't let them do that to us again. We are for less taxes. We should be for less taxes. We should be for cutting spending and providing real private sector jobs. We should be for a strong America that calls out for freedom. Freedom is important. Freedom, as the President said in the State of the Union message, works. You know, I think one of the great movements in the world today is the freedom versus peace movement. And I think it's very important to recognize that peace alone does not guarantee freedom. And for entirely too long, we have allowed peace groups to argue for peace when we should be arguing for freedom. There may or may not be peace in Cuba, but there is no freedom. And that point should be made starkly clear to the American public. Finally, on the social issues, we should not be afraid to pick a social issue, whether it be the death penalty in New York or crime or drugs somewhere else, as well as the religious issues, and stick to them and stand by them. You know, if we change our positions for political purposes, we will be seen weak. And then that will be seen as the character flaw and the personality flaw. This is a whole stew. There isn't one way to win an election. Demographics will out. You could do everything I've said to do and do it in Harlem against Charlie Rangel, and you're going to lose and get 10% of the vote. I am not suggesting that there's a formula. I am suggesting that there is a model in which we ought to be operating, and we lost our way in 1990, and I think the war has helped us regain it for 1992. Thank you.
I'm sure, or at least I hope, that some of you all have questions. I see there are microphones there. Please go to the microphone if you have one, and make them as brief as possible. Ask whoever you want up here.